Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm Katie Earl, and I coordinate our University Express program, and we're joined here today with my colleague, Alex Lauer. She's the coordinator of our RSVP program. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Katie.
Oh, welcome. I appreciate you being here and appreciate you doing this for us. Before we get into her presentation, folks, I'll just quickly breeze through our normal housekeeping because we have some new folks on here today. We are recording the session, and I'll try to post it on the website in the near future. And as Alex goes through her program, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those right into the Q&A panel as soon as it pops into your head, and we'll try to get to as many as we can throughout the presentation and also at the end too. So if you're on a computer, look at the lower right-hand side of your screen. That's where you'll find your Q&A. Click on that to expand it, and you'll see the text box. And if you're on a tablet or smartphone, touch your screen. That brings up your control panel. Click on that circle with 3 dots, and there you'll find your Q&A. So same for you. Just find that text box and type in your things to me. And yeah, we hope you have some fun with us today. So quickly, we'll thank our sponsors. It's our Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for their support. And please do not hesitate to contact us at Senior Services. If you need anything or you're not sure where to start, we'll be happy to help you out. We're at 858-8526. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alex so she can tell you what we're talking about today and a little bit about herself. Go ahead, Alex.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on a really beautiful Thursday afternoon. I hope you're as excited about this topic as I am. So in advance, I apologize if I don't do the subject of volunteering justice. It's something I'm really excited about and passionate about, and I hope that you will leave this presentation feeling the same way. I'll go to my next slide. All right, so this is the course that you signed up for. So I guess this is the point where if this doesn't look familiar, it's your chance to get out. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. Service to others has been a critical piece of the American national identity since the founding of our country. So whether reflecting on national service through the military, Peace Corps, or AmeriCorps programs, or on volunteering with community nonprofits or religious organizations, it's clear that the idea of volunteering is part of our American identity. So today we're going to explore some really, I hope, fun topics, and I've got some fun pictures for us. We'll talk a little bit about the Great Awakening, the foundation of the first charity organizations in the United States. We'll learn why Tennessee is called a volunteer state. Spoiler alert, it's not as exciting of a story as you might initially think. And we'll also examine a little bit what some of the needs are in our community while specifically focusing on the future of volunteering and the substantial impact that volunteers over the age of 55 can make. So over here you'll see a photo of some Red Cross volunteers assembling gauze influenza masks for use at Camp Devens in Massachusetts. And no, it's not during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was during the 1918 flu pandemic. So it's interesting. A lot of the things we'll talk about today, it's sort of like the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I guess I should introduce myself. I think this is just an excuse for me to show one of my all-time favorite photos. I think I should probably use this as my LinkedIn picture. But why should you be listening to me today while I talk about volunteering? Well, I am the short girl using a pair of Velociraptor claws as teeth due to some bad photography direction on that photo shoot. But my real first experience with volunteering was as one of the, well, actually the first child volunteer at the Buffalo Museum of Science. So we volunteered there as a family. Going on in my life, I spent a year as an AmeriCorps Vista, which was one of the best years of my life, absolutely changed the direction of my life. So I'm very passionate about national service. Currently, some of the things that I volunteer with, I am a City of Buffalo animal shelter volunteer. I volunteer with Make-A-Wish of Western New York as a wish granter. I am on the board of the Sloan Comfort Care Home, which is the first palliative care home in Western New York. I'm also on the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network board. And in terms of my professional experience, right now I am privileged every single day to get to coordinate the retired and senior volunteer program here, as Katie said, as her colleague at the Erie County Department of Senior Services. Previously, I was the chief of staff at the Veterans One Stop Center of Western New York, which is a nonprofit organization. And most recently, I was the director of development at the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park. So as a quick plug, if you haven't been down there lately, absolutely make your way down there. They're doing some really exciting, amazing things. So yeah, we'll keep moving along. So we're going to start off with I call it a brief history of American volunteering. And the reason I really want to focus on the fact that it is a brief history is because the way history works is that it really does focus typically on a certain way of telling history. So if as we're going through this presentation, you say, wow, this seems very focused on middle and upper class. Wow, this seems very focused on white communities. That's absolutely true. A lot of volunteer work is undocumented. A lot of volunteer work can just look like doing good things for the people around you and never getting noticed for it. So I just want to caveat that right at the beginning here, as we are in 2021 and we're all learning how to do better. So I figure we will try and actually define the word volunteer, which sounds very simple. This was actually the slide I finished last as part of my presentation. So I started with my all-time favorite dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, which usually provides a very comprehensive, in-depth look at where language comes from and where words come from. And I hate to say it, but the OED really let me down this time. So the OED defines volunteering as to offer one's help or services freely without being persuaded or forced, which to me, that doesn't really capture the spirit of volunteering. So I thought maybe the Merriam-Webster would do a little better. And they, I'm still going to say we're still not quite where I'd like us to be. But their definition was a person who voluntarily undertakes or expresses a willingness to undertake a service, such as one who renders a service or takes part in a transaction while having no legal concern or interest. As I hope you'll walk away from our presentation today recognizing these definitions don't come close to what we sort of use the term to mean today. There are a lot of ways in which this falls short. But again, we'll be considering more organized volunteer efforts today. And again, that is just because finding that documentation for those less structured efforts can be a significant challenge. So this is a heavily abridged and incomplete story of volunteering, and it is one that continues to evolve as we re-examine our history and our path forward. So here we have a photo. Obviously, some of the times that volunteering becomes most visible in our nation is when we have, unfortunately, a disaster or a catastrophe. But this is a photo from Hurricane Harvey. This is a member of the all-volunteer Cajun Navy, which I think gets points for genuinely having one of the coolest volunteer group names of all time. So some of the earliest formal volunteers in the United States were actually firefighters. So as you can imagine, back in the early 1700s, fire and building codes were not in place the way they are today, and they certainly weren't enforced to the level that they are today. So fire was a significant risk to some of those early communities. Homes were built of wood, and they were heated by open hearths and fireplaces. Which if you've toured any sort of these historic homes and you know the size of the skirts women were wearing back then, you can recognize this was a substantial fire hazard. So members of fire companies would pledge to help one another out if a fire should break out or threaten one of their homes or businesses. So not only would they attempt to put out the flames, but they would also help to save goods from within the building and protect the building from looters. So good to know, even in the 1700s, looting was still a concern that people had. But the issue with these early fire companies was that members were not required to help protect properties of non-members. So they had a pretty strong incentive for people to volunteer, which if you remember our earlier definition of volunteering, if you have your own sort of legal interest or concern, is it really volunteering? The first fire company that really was a volunteer fire company that did not have that sort of membership requirement was the Union Fire Company in Pennsylvania, and that was incorporated in 1736. And if you can tell from this picture that I've included here of Benjamin Franklin, I know it looks photoshopped. It is an actual painting by Charles Washington Wright. It was painted in 1850. As a fun fact, and I'm going to try and put some fun facts in here today to keep you, engaged on this beautiful afternoon. There is an issue with this painting. The helmet that Benjamin Franklin is wearing was not actually invented until more than 30 years after Benjamin Franklin had died. So they just sort of stuck it on his head as a cool tribute to the fire company that he helped found. And this idea of having volunteers as firefighters has continued, and today more than 70% of our nation's firefighters are still volunteers. So they have some of the best recruitment materials, I think, in terms of looking for volunteers. As you can see here, there's a 2019 ad, Real Heroes Don't Wear Capes, a volunteer. Very intense. So volunteering really started taking off during what's called the Second Great Awakening. There were actually many Great Awakenings, as I learned while preparing for this presentation. The Second Great Awakening is usually the one people are thinking of. But it was a religious rejuvenation in the 1820s, and it inspired waves of social reform. And those social reforms included things like temperance, the abolition of slavery, and women's rights. And it really moved younger people to get involved with volunteer efforts. Something that I thought was really interesting is that the center of revivalism for this movement was actually Western New York. And Western New York during that time, well, actually after that time period, was called the Burned Over District, which was so named for its overabundance of hellfire and damnation preaching, and the fact that we produced dozens of new denominations, communal societies, and reform. So some of those religious movements that we are really sort of responsible for here in Western and Central New York include Mormonism, the Millerites, who were the predecessors of the Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Shakers. As I know, University Express has done classes, I won't dwell on it, but the Lilydale community was a big part of the spiritualism movement going on at this time. But really, the Second Great Awakening is well known for what's pictured here on the slide, which are their camp revivals, where they would bring together community members and preach, and there would be food and much carousing, as you can sort of see here from this engraving. The one big thing was that the Second Great Awakening and a lot of these religious movements emphasized this idea of personal responsibility, and the ability of people to do sort of Christ-like work in their communities. And that emphasis helped not only these important social movements, but also volunteer efforts that would come later. The last thing that I want to mention as looking at this engraving is the preponderance of women that are pictured here. You do see a few men, but it's a lot of women. And that was something that was really remarkable during this movement. Women were actually converting at rates of nearly 3 women for every 2 men. So this was a heavily female movement. It was a movement that was talking about individual responsibility, and that was something that was a little bit different for folks. And you'll see how that impacts volunteering as we keep moving. So here we have ALEXIS de Tocqueville, and ALEXIS came over to the United States. He was a French aristocrat, a political scientist, and in 1831, he visited the United States, and his plan was to research and study the American penal system. What ended up sort of happening is that he really fell in love with America, was fascinated by the broader workings of American society, including this sort of uniquely American tendency towards volunteerism. So in his book, which I have a picture of obviously a much later edition, in his book, Democracy in America, he had a few quotes that really spoke to what was going on in America. But he talks a lot about this idea that people would seek each other out and unite together when they had an opinion or an idea that they wished to promote in society. So this power of organizing was something that he really saw as uniquely American. And he keeps talking, Americans grouped together to hold fates, found seminaries, build inns, construct churches, distribute books, dispatch missionaries. They establish hospitals, prisons, schools by the same method. So again, he's emphasizing this idea that Americans, when they have a good idea, they like to get together and promote it. But my favorite quote from Alexis is this last one here. And for those of you who may not be able to see it, I will read it word for word. So he says, I have seen Americans making great and sincere sacrifices for the key common good, and 100 times I've noticed that when needs be, they almost always gave each other faithful support. So Alexis was one of the early big fans of America and noted something special was going on here. Of course, not long after that, the Civil War hit. And so some of the things that came about with the Civil War they were called Soldiers' Aid Societies or Ladies' Aid Societies. So over 3 months before the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter, Southern women actually came together through existing social organizations, and they were making cartridges and preparing sandbags, and rolling bandages. 2 days after the fighting actually began, Northern women also started joining in the war effort. So those efforts started out in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they founded the first official Soldiers' Aid Society in 1861. So when these societies first started in the North, African American women would join the white women's societies, but as soon as Black men were able to enlist, they separated and formed their own societies and provided support strictly to African American soldiers. Um, in the North, as many as 20,000 aid organizations were set up. In the South, unfortunately, record keeping was poor, so it's hard to know how many they had set up there. But historians note that almost every town and village had some form of a women's aid society, so the numbers were probably very significant. But what's really interesting and what sort of starts happening as the war effort continues. Um, and what was happening was that soldiers were dying more from really horrible diseases and lack of sanitary efforts more than they were dying from battle. So these soldiers' aid societies became even more important because the things that they were supplying, things like food, tents, clothing, blankets, bandages, those were things that the government wasn't doing a good job of providing. And these ladies' aid societies or soldiers' aid societies were doing a great job at sending. So the United States government came together and formed the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So if you're able to look at this photo we have here, you'll see, it says U.S. Sanitary Commission, and then right under that it says Soldiers' Aid Society, and this was an office in Philadelphia. So the women were able to purchase these items because they raised donations. So they were some of the early fundraisers. They were hosting social events such as concerts, dinners, dances, and fairs. And this was happening in both the North and the South. And collectively, Northern women's groups raised almost $5 million in cash and $15 million worth of goods that they were able to send. The other thing that's interesting is that after the war, many of the women who served in these aid societies went on to join suffrage societies, and using their legacy of sacrifice and leadership, they started engaging more in politics. The organizations that were founded by African American women would go on to provide for the needs of former slaves. They created schools for freed children, they created hospitals for freed people, and a host of other societies that were just aimed at taking care of the health and welfare of the recently emancipated. And again, just a fun fact, the ladies' aid societies actually were responsible for purchasing over 90% of the medicines that were actually used by Army surgeons, which is a pretty substantial figure. So the government recognized that. They used these soldiers' aid societies to support the U.S. Sanitary Commission and really inadvertently empowered women to recognize the power that they could have in the political sphere. So the Great Awakening comes back again. Some people say this was sort of the Second Great Awakening Part 2. Some people call it the Third Great Awakening. I call it the Great Awakening continued here. But as the 1800s continued, the rise of the social reform movement around issues like poverty, temperance, women's rights, and the abolition of slavery continued to mobilize a new generation, again, including these women and young people. So a couple of groups that I know you're going to recognize started during this time period. So the YMCA was originally founded in London in 1844, but the first chapter was opened in America in Boston in 1851. The Salvation Army, again, their first chapter was in London in 1865, but their first chapter opened in America in 1880. The American Red Cross was founded right here in the United States, in Washington, D.C. in 1881, and the United Way was started in Denver in 1887. And these institutions really served to connect this sort of new volunteer force to social services that improved the lives of others. And over here we have camp leaders at the first YMCA camp in the United States. That's back in 1887. The facial hair is truly magnificent. I think there's only a few gentlemen who are unfortunately unable to sport a mustache for this photo. So as the 20th century kicked off here, that's when mainstream volunteering really started to flourish, and it shaped many of the volunteer and nonprofit organizations that we continue to recognize even today. So in the early 1900s, some groups that started included the Junior League. They started in 1901. Rotary International came about in 1905. Kiwanis Club came about in 1915, and the Lions Club in 1917. So these organizations, they were designed really to bring together business people or sort of these upper class women to quote unquote do good. Their definition of what doing good looked like could differ, and while they were designed to do good, it was really a social event for folks. It was a mark of status to be part of the Kiwanis Club or to be a member of Junior League. And that's changed a lot over the years. Many of these groups used to be invitation only, whereas now you can join just by going online, which I think is a great change. And over here, it's the first National Convention of Rotary Clubs. This was in Portland, Oregon, and that was in 1911. So you can see they have Lincoln, Providence, Kansas City, Chicago, representatives from all across the United States. So the Great Depression obviously mobilized a lot of volunteers across the United States. So the 1930s, soup kitchens were initially run and funded by charitable organizations such as churches, religious groups, missions, again, those ladies' aid societies, women's leagues, and the Salvation Army. They were dependent on donations from local businesses and from private individuals. Many individuals actually would help to grow gardens that would then the produce would then go towards the soup kitchen. Eventually, the situation became so dire that President Hoover, who was a big believer in the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, thought that it was people's individual responsibility to take care of themselves. But these soup kitchen lines were getting so long, the bread lines were so long, that in 1932, President Hoover authorized $4 million to states to actually open up more of these soup kitchens. A fun fact here is that one of the largest and best run soup kitchens during the Great Depression was actually run by Al Capone. So you may know Al Capone more for his role as the bootlegging crime boss of the Chicago Mafia. But during this time, he was trying to clean up his image, and he financed one of the first soup kitchens in Chicago. He earned a reputation as a modern-day Robin Hood with the poor and destitute in Chicago, who rightly said that Al Capone was doing more for the unemployed than the U.S. government, and that's very true. Yeah, he was attracting, sort of this positive press, and one of the headlines was, 120,000 meals are served by Capone-free soup kitchen. So the Great Depression really did serve as one of the first nationwide efforts to coordinate volunteers. While some served in the kitchens, again, others were growing subsistence gardens, others were providing assistance to children. But this photo was really exciting for me because this is actually out of Buffalo, New York. So this is actually on Thanksgiving Day in 1931. So this is a wide range of Buffalo citizens were lining up for food. And this was actually the Volunteers of America. It was located at 77 Broadway. Unfortunately, this beautiful building is no longer there. But it is actually right down the corner from us down here at the Rath Building. So special thank you to westernnewyorkheritage.org for that wonderful picture. And kind of a sad picture if you think about what they're standing in line for. So when we talk about volunteering, one of the big ways that nonprofits utilize volunteers is for development, which is just a fancy word for fundraising. The March of Dimes actually was the organization that really modernized fundraising. They were founded in 1938 by President Roosevelt, and it was originally called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. It became the March of Dimes because back in the 1930s, there was a singer who was well known. I have never heard him, but he apparently comes highly recommended. Eddie Cantor jokingly urged the public at a fundraiser. He asked people to send dimes to the President of the United States to raise funds. While the public didn't take it as a joke, they actually sent almost 3 million dimes and thousands of dollars of donations to the White House. And this was something that the group ended up capitalizing on. So instead of relying on big philanthropists, they were actually just relying on everyday people to support the mission of this organization. March of Dimes actually ended up collecting over 7 billion dimes, many of them from school children, and $500 million ended up going towards the war on polio. Those funds did directly contribute to the creation of the first polio vaccine. But this was really a unique social invention at the time because it was a permanently self-sustaining source of funds for the support of research. They had a centralized administration, but then they had state and local chapters. And what made them unique was they just had this huge core of volunteers that were out there hitting the streets, fundraising from their friends and neighbors. And they ended up becoming the prototype for dozens of similar foundations. So if you've ever been asked to support an organization by a friend or family member or neighbor, you can thank the March of Dimes for that. And a fun fact, and maybe more people know this than I did, the reason Roosevelt is actually the president featured on the dime is because of his role in the March of Dimes. So now we skip a couple of years here before volunteering sort of gets front page news again, and we head to the 1960s. So there were a lot of social movements going on in the 1960s, but there are really 3 men that sort of take the lead in this idea of national service. Pretty sure you can guess who they are, but we have JFK really started promoting this ideal of national service outside of military service. We have Lyndon B. Johnson and his war on poverty, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s calls to activism and student leadership and servant leadership, excuse me. So again, this sort of idea of personal responsibility of living sort of your faith and your belief system, it became very visible in a lot of these protests, a lot of the marches, a lot of the signs that you started to see. This is just one of many, many protests of that era. So John F. Kennedy, he really has a lot to do with national service and the way national service looks today. He announced the idea of the Peace Corps in 1960 while on the campaign trail at the University of Michigan. He gives a very short speech to the students assembled there. It's late at night. He's ready to go to bed. So his speech is literally, I mean, it's maybe 6 paragraphs long. And it primarily centers around this idea that he's going to create a Peace Corps. And so I'll read a direct quote because nobody says it better than JFK himself. So let me say in conclusion, this university is not merely to help its graduates have an economic advantage in the life struggle. There is certainly a greater purpose, and I'm sure you recognize it. Therefore, I do not apologize for asking for your support in this campaign. I come here tonight asking your support for this country over the next decade. And so what he asks them is he asks, how many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana? Technicians or engineers, how many of you are willing to work in the foreign service and spend your lives traveling around the world? So his call really resonates with these students and has resonated with people since then, because since 1961, over 240,000 Americans have done 2 years of service with the Peace Corps. And again, he's really promoting an idea of national service, not necessarily military service, which is a big sort of shift for the government. And as you know, right, his big famous quote, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So the photos, we have him signing the Peace Corps into existence at, the desk. And then the first Peace Corps mission to Ghana, they're boarding the Pan Am flight and very excited to get to work and promote this sort of American idea of service on a national and an international level, I should say. So LBJ carried forward a lot of JFK's ideas, and the big one, and one that was very close to LBJ's heart, was obviously the idea of the war on poverty. Whether that war has been a success or not is absolutely something that's still up for debate. However, what is not debatable is the fact that the Volunteers in Service to America program, which is VISTA for short, was created by LBJ. It was passed as part of his Economic Opportunity Act in 1964, and it was really intended to be a domestic version of the Peace Corps. And when I say that's not debatable, it's the fact that that has been a very successful component of the war on poverty that has endured for all these years, in spite of many threats to its existence as sort of political priorities have changed. The purpose of VISTA is really to supplement efforts to fight poverty in low-income communities by engaging Americans from all walks of life in a year of full-time service. So they are compensated for that year. They live on, they call them poverty level wages, so they sort of get a direct experience of what living in poverty is like. And we are host to many AmeriCorps Vistas here in Western New York. There are nonprofit organizations that host them. The city of Buffalo has a large core of AmeriCorps Vistas as well. So when the war on poverty was started, the poverty rate in the United States was around 19%. And so VISTA assumes different priorities depending on who is in office and what they would like to focus on. Currently, VISTA focuses primarily on veterans and military families, education, and healthy communities. So the title of this presentation actually comes from Martin Luther King Jr.'s final sermon, which was given at, I'm so excited about the next slide, I skipped right ahead. But the title is taken from MLK Jr.'s final sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was given 2 months before he was assassinated, so on February 4th, 1968. And the whole sermon is incredible. And I actually read it in full for the first time, getting ready for this presentation. And I will take a second. I think I'm doing okay on time. I have enough time to actually read this to you. But this was MLK's sermon. So he says, "If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant." That's a new definition of greatness. And this morning, or this afternoon, the thing that I like about it, by giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant. So I think what's really amazing is that we have 3 men in a very short span of time that all 3 of them are sort of talking about the same things. And it's this idea of service, this idea of national service, this idea of giving back to your community. And even the protests tie into this because it's this idea that people can have an impact on their community and that people want to have a better society that they can live in. And of course, because you can't just dedicate one slide to Martin Luther King Jr., this is another famous quote of his: "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" So Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is one that has obviously continued. We have a holiday named for him. And over the past few years, the federal government has really tried to make this push, and they're saying they want to make it a day on, not a day off. So they're continuing to promote this idea of spend this day doing something good for your community, volunteer, get involved, don't just enjoy a day off of work. So we've reached the point in the presentation where the program that I am involved in hits the scene. So that is the Retired and Senior Volunteer Program. And that launched in the spring of 1971 as a way to harness the power of older volunteers. So this program grew tremendously. It started with 11 pilot projects in 1971, and in only 3 years, it had grown to 666 projects. It is open to all Americans age 55 plus. When it started, it was only 60 plus, but then they did end up dropping that age requirement, which is why you may be thinking 55, that's not a senior, and I agree with you. So Erie County, we host around 300 RSVP volunteers at over 75 host sites. Some of our largest focus areas for the program include veterans and military families, education, aging in place, environmental conservation, and we get this really nifty category called other community priorities that we utilize pretty heavily because we like to focus on our arts and cultural institutions. Those are some of our most popular sites. They offer some really interesting volunteer opportunities, and those include the Buffalo Museum of Science, the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park, and the Buffalo Zoo. This picture, I know we really like fast forwarded here. We went from the 60s to this super beautiful iPhone photo here. This is one of our Erie County RSVP volunteers with Meals on Wheels during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see she's masked up, but still ready to deliver meals. They kept going during the pandemic. So the idea of national service is not limited by party lines, and I wanted to make sure that we touched on 1,000 points of light, which was a concept that George H.W. Bush was very big on. He was actually sort of teased about it in the press. The press wasn't a big fan of this concept, but he stuck with it. And so he, during his presidency, honored more than 1,000 everyday Americans who were volunteering their time to make a difference in their communities. And that sort of commitment carried over to the creation of the Points of Light Foundation, which now promotes themselves as the largest volunteer organization in the world. So they don't just serve the United States, they're everywhere. They continue to give this Points of Light award. We've had local honorees, which is really incredible. But yeah, President Bush was a big supporter. And he's got, he has some very lovely quotes about service as well. But his idea was that our volunteers in these organizations that they were serving with were 1,000 points of light, and were providing this sort of shining light and this beacon for Americans and for the rest of the world. And again, he talked a lot about the old ideas are new again because they're not old, they are timeless. So he talked a lot of the same things we were hearing in the 60s: duty, sacrifice, commitment, and a patriotism that finds its expression in taking part and pitching in. So the work that President Bush sort of continued was then continued again under President Clinton. And President Clinton combined a few different governmental organizations into one organization, which was called the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is a bizarre name, and has recently been changed to AmeriCorps. So you can see here the old logo, the new logo. We're excited to be AmeriCorps. Not sure we love the logo yet, but we'll wait and see here. But the Corporation for National and Community Service has engaged more than 5 million Americans in service through various national service initiatives. Their goal is to improve lives, strengthen communities, and foster civic engagement through service and engagement. Again, it was created in 1993. Some of the groups that it includes, and you can see there are so many that I have a dangling comma there, but it includes AmeriCorps, City Year, AmeriCorps Seniors, the National Civilian Conservation Corps, the VISTA program, Opportunity Corps, the list goes on and on and on. But this is something that is in a lot of ways very uniquely American, this sort of government commitment to the idea of volunteering. It doesn't necessarily exist in other countries, so we're very fortunate to have it. This agency has survived all kinds of administrations, both friendly and unfriendly, and has managed to stay funded through all that time. So we're very fortunate to have it. So September 11th really changed a lot of things, and the volunteer world and the nonprofit world is no exception. So after 9/11, volunteerism really started to uptick. We saw more volunteers, more people wanted to get involved in their communities. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, volunteerism in the United States peaked between 2003 and 2005. And during that time period, 28.8% of Americans reported having volunteered in the previous year. As of 2019, that number is now down to 25.3%. So there's a lot of discussion in the volunteer management community about how do we sort of change that trend. There's a lot of talk about re-examining what our definition of volunteering is, and we'll get into that a little bit later here. But I will say that the need for volunteers continues to grow. Our nonprofit sector has grown by 25% in the past decade, so that's a lot of groups that are out looking for volunteers. And this photo from September 11th, I think it says a lot of things. Obviously, as I said earlier, disasters, and we all know disasters bring out the best in a lot of people in terms of our response efforts. So obviously the focus in this photo here is the firefighter, but what I love is that in the background, but not hidden, but off to the side, are these American Red Cross Disaster Services response volunteers. So while the focus may be on the firefighter, we also have this group of volunteer effort that is there providing the support that he needs to do his job. So, and then we're going to skip ahead again because COVID-19 again really changed our volunteer landscape. When the stay-at-home orders started coming out, internally here at Erie County, we started looking, and we weren't sure how this was going to work. You know, we were encouraging our volunteers to stay safe, but also many of our nonprofit partners were saying we need volunteers more than ever. So we don't know what the volunteer response nationwide looks like yet. I have a feeling if Erie County is any kind of a benchmark, that we will see that while there may have been a decline, it won't have been as significant as people might think. Many volunteers did continue in their roles, doing things like you can see here. We had food pantries were still in operation. As you saw earlier, Meals on Wheels was still delivering to our homebound seniors, and many people adjusted their volunteering. So in this photo here, we have Erie County RSVP volunteers at a clinic where we were distributing vaccines, and we also have an Erie County RSVP volunteer making masks. So there were a lot of new ways that people found to volunteer. So let's talk about why people choose to volunteer. So what's the appeal of volunteering? So here are some of the reasons why our RSVP volunteers say they do it. They say it makes them feel good. They say it makes them feel more connected with their community. They get to try new things. One of our favorites that we hear pretty often is, I've been blessed in my life and I want to give back. We've also had a number of spouses that volunteer together, so it's something that they're able to do together. We've also had spouses who say, nope, I don't want you volunteering on my day. You know, Tuesdays is my day at the nature preserve. You can come another day. We have folks who tell us that after retiring, it gives them something to do with their time. You go from having like a very regimented schedule to having some more free time that you can fill how you want to fill it. We have a lot of volunteers that actually end up making good friends at their volunteering events. And so yeah, they like to go and they get to spend time with their friends. And the one thing that we hear over and over and over again is, I know I make a difference. And that sense of purpose is not only a nice thing to have, but The science backs us up on this. Volunteering is good for you. So volunteering helps you live longer. It improves your physical health, including decreasing the likelihood of developing high blood pressure by 40%. And volunteering after a heart attack, it decreases your chances of developing post-heart attack complications. Volunteers have decreased stress levels. They have lower levels of depression and anxiety. Volunteering increases your self-confidence. It increases your self-esteem. Retirees who volunteer report significantly higher levels of happiness than those who do not volunteer. There's some really exciting research going on right now that suggests that volunteering can actually lower your risk of dementia. And volunteers get more steps in every day, and they are more physically active than non-volunteer peers. So I think this all gets back to this idea. Volunteering gives us a sense of purpose, and that's why it can be especially appealing to our older adults. And I say older, thinking 55 does not sound older to me. But especially for those who are retiring, for those who may have an empty nest, for those who just have a little extra time on their hands, it's a great way to fill your time. And the sweet spot, sort of the magic number in terms of what the science says is going to be most beneficial, is it seems to hover around 100 hours a year, which if you think about that, it's only 2 to 3 hours per week. So however you choose to divvy that up, 100 hours a year is when you're going to really start seeing benefits from it. So we talked about the history of volunteering, and I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about what the future of volunteering might look like. So we have more one-time events listed up here, and this is going to be a reality as nonprofits have to adjust to what volunteers are willing and able to do. So our younger volunteers, younger senior volunteers, are more interested in one-time volunteer opportunities rather than regularly scheduled volunteer shifts. So that is a change. The old model, the idea was, oh, we're going to find a volunteer. This volunteer will come in for a volunteer shift once a week on Mondays from, 8 to 4:30. That's not the model that volunteers are looking for anymore. And so we're slowly starting to see many of our partners are able to shift that expectation, which is great. There still is a significant need, though. Don't be, put off. There's still a significant need for volunteers on a regular basis who are willing to put in a full day shift or a half day shift. It's definitely still a need. Most of our nonprofits are looking for those people, so do not be deterred or discouraged. Micro volunteering is something that I'm really excited about because it's volunteering that can be done in small bursts or short periods of time. And that can be something really simple. And this does require us to sort of change our definition of volunteering, but a lot of micro volunteering is just about promoting different causes. So that could be something as simple as liking a Facebook page of a group that you support, or sharing a post. I know University Express is very active on Facebook, so you could give them a like and a share. You could do something as simple as signing a petition. You could bake a cake for a bake sale. You can count birds in your garden to help there's a census every year of songbirds. So these tasks just help raise awareness. They help accomplish something that needs to be done, but they don't require a heavy lift on your part. A lot of times micro volunteering can be confused with virtual volunteering, but they are two distinct things. Virtual volunteering offers a whole new horizon of things that you can try. And this is something that really grew over the pandemic. Some of my personal favorite opportunities are you can transcribe historic documents for the Smithsonian Institution. Very cool. You can help monitor wildlife cameras to look for endangered species around the world. So cool. Or you can help mentor a newly separated veteran as they look for their next educational or career opportunity. So those are just 3 opportunities. There are so many more that are out there, but those are things that are available today. So if you decide that you want to try that the next rainy day we have, you can hop right in. You don't have to go through a long training. You don't have to leave the comfort of your house. You are all technological pros at this point, so you should feel very empowered to just dive right in. And you can always just Google virtual volunteering and lots of different opportunities will come up. So in terms of finding what you want to do, I hope that if you're not already volunteering, that you'll leave here today thinking, I really want to get involved and feel empowered to do that. So here are just some tips to help you figure out what's next. I think it's really important that you find something that you're passionate about and that you're excited about. So when we're talking about finding things that you're passionate about, it may be thinking about what things make you angry. So if it makes you angry that you think kids can't write cursive anymore, maybe you want to volunteer in education. And on the flip side of that, what things make you happy? Maybe you love it when you see those Facebook posts about kittens getting adopted. You can volunteer to help get cats adopted. Um, the next step is sort of decide, do you want to build on skills that you already have, or do you want to do something completely different? There are such amazing volunteer opportunities here in Western New York. We hear fantastic stories all the time of volunteers who end up doing things in their volunteer life that they never did in their career. So, for example, there is the Carousel Museum in North Tonawanda. We have volunteers that go there and refinish carousel horses, which is not actually a career path I think you can take anymore in 2021. So it's a great way to try something new out. You're going to want to figure out your time commitment. I'll be honest with you, nonprofits, we're always very excited when someone expresses interest. So we don't want you to get burned out. So figure out what you're comfortable with in terms of your volunteer service. If you think, yes, I want to give on a regular basis, I want to be there on Tuesdays, that's fantastic. But if that's not something you're looking to do, just be honest with yourself and be upfront with the site, and there's always going to be a place that they can find for you. You're going to want to identify an organization that you believe in. So not all nonprofits are created equal. It's not very hard to get your nonprofit license. So you're going to want to find an organization that has a mission that you believe in. You're going to want to find an organization where you feel comfortable serving. The good news is if you try one and it's not a good fit, there are at least 10 more that do something very similar. So don't be discouraged if the first one isn't the right fit. In terms of identifying an organization you believe in, some of the ways you can figure that out, you may want to look at their website. You may want to check out their social media. If you're planning to get very involved in, especially if you're looking to donate money, you may want to pull, it's called their 990, which is their financial reporting, and you can get a really in-depth view of what the organization does with the money that they're fundraising. Or you may want to attend an event that they're hosting just as a guest. Show up. If they're doing a basket raffle, if they're doing a chicken barbecue, just show up, see how it's run, see, do the volunteers look like they're having a good time, or are they all yelling at each other? So you want to definitely scope them out before you commit. You may also want to ask your network, where are your friends volunteering? Where are your grandkids volunteering? Word of mouth is a great recruitment tool. So if you put yourself out there and say, I'm looking to volunteer, what's out there, you might be surprised at where some of your loved ones are volunteering. And the last one is try different opportunities out. There are a lot of volunteer opportunities that I have tried that just have not been the right fit for me. But you keep going back, you try different things, and eventually you're going to find something that is the best fit for you. So, oh my gosh, my timing is just perfect. This is our final slide here. Here are just some of the takeaways that I hope you'll take from today's presentation. The first is that volunteering is something that's uniquely American. Americans are 15% more likely to volunteer time than the Dutch, we're 21% more likely than the Swiss, and we're 32% more likely than Germans. I'm not sure how they picked those specific groups to focus on. I'm assuming that's the only place this data was available for, but still, we're coming out on top, which that's an area I'm happy to be on top in. There are also local organizations that can benefit from your time, talent, or treasure. So that's a big thing in nonprofits that they talk about. It's, can you give time, can you give talent, or treasure, which is obviously money. But you can give any one of those things, you can combine those things, but whichever one of those three that you're able to give, I guarantee you there's a nonprofit that would be very grateful to have you. And the last thing is that if you want to volunteer, RSVP is here to help. We're happy to talk you through it. While we don't partner with every single nonprofit in Western New York, we know a lot of nonprofits. We can help steer you in the right direction and help you maybe weed through some opportunities. Or we're happy just to talk to you about what you might be interested in. So my contact info is there. I would love to hear from you, even if you don't want to join RSVP. We believe that seniors volunteering can really help change the narrative of what aging is, what it has to look like, and it really puts a great spin on what aging can be. So with that, I will hopefully be able to field any questions that came in. But yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your impeccable timing. And before we get to some questions and comments here, we do have one person calling in. So would you mind giving your email and the phone number they can reach you and RSVP at, please?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So my phone number here, and this is my direct number, is area code 716-858-8081. And my email address is very long. It is Alexandra, ALEXANDRA .LAUER, and that's at Erie, ERIE.gov. And I apologize for spelling out Erie. I recognize now everyone on this call knows how to spell Erie.
Maybe not. You never know. But thank you so much for that presentation and all of the time you put into it. I'm sure it was a lot, and you delivered, I think, just the perfect amount of justice to volunteering, Alex.
Well, thank you for having us, Katie.
Of course, not that you had a choice, right? You were voluntold.
I was voluntold, and I almost did a slide with your picture on it that said voluntold, but I was actually happy to be here, so I didn't want to jeopardize my standing in the University Express course catalog. So
Good thinking there. Okay, so we'll get to our questions and comments. So we have, thank you for reminding us that we can all do good.
oh, that's great. And it is true. Everybody can do good. And I hope one of the things too that you'll take away, man, I should have redone this takeaway slide. Even if you're not engaged in formal volunteering, all of us volunteer in some capacity. We all do nice things for our neighbors. We all pull in the garbage cans. We all, help mow their lawn, help shovel their driveway. You don't have to be a formal volunteer to do good things in your community. It's just, this is a more organized way to be involved. So yes, everyone can do good. There's a job for everybody out there. Absolutely.
I agree. This next question is, what was your favorite fact that you learned while putting together your presentation?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I've been working on this presentation for like 10 years because I started it during the pandemic while we were working remotely. Wow, what was my favorite fact? Um, I really enjoyed learning more about the war on poverty and sort of the founding of AmeriCorps Vista. As I said, I served as an AmeriCorps Vista. I now get to run an AmeriCorps Seniors program, which is something I never thought I'd have the opportunity to do. But really learning about, LBJ and sort of his personal relationship to poverty, where his father had been very successful and then lost everything and put the families, live like welfare in jeopardy, and they were constantly afraid of losing their home. So seeing that he had that really personal tie, and it wasn't just him continuing something that JFK had started, that he really was very passionate, whether you agree with all of the steps he took or not. That was very fun. I also really enjoyed the burned over district of Western New York. I had never heard of that before, so I really got a hoot out of looking into some of that hellfire and damnation preaching.
Thank you, Alex. That might need to be its own presentation.
I think you have to find someone that can do that justice, and it is not me, but yes, I would attend that presentation.
Okay, I'll get to working on that. This last question is, well, a comment in both. So it says, great presentation, much more than I expected. How can I find out more about RSVP? Our orientation sessions planned?
That's a great question. So during COVID-19, we went to a remote model for doing our orientation. So we're hoping to go back to in-person orientations very soon. But if you're interested in signing up for our RSVP newsletter, which is where we send out some opportunities that we have, you can send an email. This email address is much easier than the long one. It is just rsvp@erie.gov, and we'd love to get you on our newsletter. Like I said, we offer a lot of one-time volunteering opportunities, and that's a really easy way to get involved with RSVP.
Thank you, Alex. Then we have this last thing here is, I thought Great JFK line was about getting recruits for the military. I never knew it was about recruiting volunteers.
It is fascinating, sort of the way that JFK blended the military and national service. I think he was a very masterful politician, but yes, I was under the same impression. And then reading through that entire speech and looking at what his campaign was based on, yes, he was absolutely, I think it served dual purposes, which is, it was recruiting for military service, but it was also recruiting for some of these projects that he was really passionate about, which was Vista, which unfortunately he never got to see in his lifetime, but also the Peace Corps. So yeah, it's definitely the line between national service in a volunteer sense and a military sense is very thin and continues to be thin.
All right, well, thank you, Alex. We'll just give it another second here to see if anything else rolls in. But otherwise, I appreciate you for doing this and for heading up RSVP, and to Kitty for everything she does to support the program as well. So thank you very much. And everyone who's on, thanks for your time today.